At some point, people realized they were going deeper than they truly understood. Not deeper in distance, but deeper in impact. And that realization changed how Mammoth Cave could be treated. For a long time, there was no clear line. People kept going deep into the Mammoth Cave system, not because they had reached the end, not because the cave had been fully explored, but because the system kept allowing it. More paths were opened, more people were brought inside, and gradually the cave began to change in ways that could no longer be ignored or managed safely. Mammoth Cave is not an ordinary cave. It is the longest cave system ever recorded by humans. Hundreds of kilometers of passages have already been surveyed, and every year, that number continues to grow. But what matters most is not how much has been mapped. It is how much has not. Large portions of the system lie beyond what humans can safely access, not because they are unknown, but because reaching them comes with consequences. For generations, Mammoth Cave was seen not only as a natural wonder, but as a place to be used. First for extraction, then for research, and eventually for public access. Paths were built, lights were installed, tour routes were created. Permanent darkness was turned into a space people could walk through, and for a long time, everything appeared stable, until it wasn't. The first signs were not dramatic. They weren't loud. They didn't make headlines. They were small changes, recorded repeatedly. Over time, airflow in certain sections became less predictable. Areas that had once remained undisturbed began to show measurable effect of constant human presence. Places once considered safe now carried documented risk. And slowly, the question began to shift. It was no longer simply, can we go deeper? It became, who is responsible when the system starts to change? Because Mammoth Caves is not an inert space. It is a living system with its own microclimate, its own geological balance, and forms of life that exist only because conditions have remained nearly unchanged for thousands of years. As human activity expanded beyond what was necessary, access stopped being a matter of curiosity. It became a matter of responsibility. That was when certain passages were restricted. Certain areas were no longer open to the public. Not because of secrets, not because of legends, but because authorities could no longer justify the risk. Because of safety, because of preservation, and because some systems, once altered, cannot be restored. That decision marked a turning point. Mammoth Cave was no longer just a place to explore. It became a place where access had to be managed, and in some cases, denied. Long before Mammoth Cave was known as a natural wonder, humans entered it for practical reasons. They came to extract mineral-rich soil inside the cave, was dug out by hand, processed, and used to produce materials considered essential in the early 19th century. At that point, the cave was not treated as a fragile system. It was treated as a resource. Passages were widened to allow movement. Areas were cleared to support work underground. Regular human presence became normal. As extraction declined, exploration increased. Surveyors pushed deeper into the system, mapping corridors, measuring chambers, and turning unknown space into documented territory. Each new connection made the cave easier to navigate, and ease of navigation changed how the cave was perceived. It was no longer a place entered only by specialists. It became a place that could be organized. Paths were reinforced. Railings were added. Permanent lighting systems were installed in key sections. Tour routes were designed to guide people safely through areas that had never been shaped for regular human movement. From the surface, this looked like progress. More people could enter, more people could learn, more people could experience what had once been inaccessible. And for a long time, nothing appeared to be wrong. The cave remained stable. Tours continued. New sections were mapped. Human presence underground became routine. What was once exceptional slowly became normal. But Mammoth Cave is not a collection of isolated spaces. It is a connected system. Air moves through it. Moisture circulates. Temperature balances across long distances underground. Every modification, a path, a light, a widened passage, became part of that system. At first, these changes were viewed as isolated improvements, small adjustments made for safety and access. Individually, well, they seemed insignificant, but taken together, they marked a shift. Mammoth Caves was no longer shaped only by geological time. It was now being shaped by human use, not through a single decision, but through accumulation. And at this stage, no one was asking whether the cave should remain untouched. The only question was how far it could be opened. For years, nothing catastrophic happened. There was no collapse, no sudden disaster, no single moment that forced an emergency response. What appeared instead were patterns, subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but impossible to ignore once they began to repeat. One of the earliest indicators came from the cave's airflow. Sections that had once maintained stable, predictable circulation began to behave differently. Air moved in unexpected directions. Temperature gradients shifted. Humidity levels no longer matched historical baselines. These were not dramatic changes, but they were measurable, and they were persistent. At the same time, biologists began noticing changes that were harder to see, but more difficult to explain. Mammoth Cave supports life that depends on consistency. Species adapted to darkness, to narrow temperature ranges, to environments that had remained nearly unchanged for thousands of years. Even small disturbances carried weight. Light introduced heat. Foot traffic introduced particles. Repeated human presence introduced variables that had never existed before. None of this happened all at once, but the data began to accumulate. In certain areas, surface materials showed signs of gradual alteration. Sediments shifted. Delicate formations became more vulnerable. Places that had remained intact under natural conditions were now being tested by constant exposure. At the same time, risk assessments began to change. Sections once considered safe required reevaluation. Routes that had functioned without incident now demanded closer monitoring, not because of fear, but because responsibility had increased. Then came a factor that forced a broader reassessment, not geological, not structural, biological. Caves across North America were facing a crisis linked to human movement between underground environments. A disease affecting bat populations spread rapidly, carried not by the animals alone, but by contact, shoes, clothing, equipment. Suddenly, access was no longer just a matter of visitor safety. It became a matter of containment. Authorities faced a problem with no simple solution. How do you protect a system that is open by nature from the very people who want to enter it? How do you balance education, research, and preservation when every entry carries risk? For Mammoth Cave, this was the point where observation turned into obligation. The signs were no longer isolated. They were interconnected. Airflow, microclimate, biology, human traffic. Each signal on its own might have been manageable. Together, they pointed in one direction, not toward panic, but toward limits. Authorities were no longer deciding whether access was convenient. They were deciding whether access was defensible. And in certain sections of the cave, the answer became clear. Some areas could no longer remain open without unacceptable risk, not to visitors alone, but to the system itself. That realization did not end exploration, but it changed who was allowed to continue it, and where, and under what conditions. Because at that stage, doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was a decision. The decision did not come suddenly. There was no announcement made in response to a single event. Instead, access to Mammoth Cave began to change quietly, through reviews, through updated protocols, through sections that were no longer included on public maps. Authorities did not describe these actions as closures at first. They were framed as adjustments, restrictions based on safety, limitations based on preservation, temporary measures intended to reduce risk. But over time, those adjustments became permanent. Certain passages were no longer open to visitors. Some routes were removed entirely from guided tours. Others were gated, sealed, or placed under controlled access, limited to trained personnel. The reasons were not dramatic. They were procedural. Risk assessments show that continued access in specific sections could no longer be justified. In some areas, air circulation was too sensitive to tolerate regular traffic. In others, delicate formation had reached a point where even minimal disturbance could cause irreversible damage. There were also concerns that could not be mitigated through signage or supervision alone. Narrow passages with limited airflow, zones where rescue would be difficult, sections where environmental stability depended on conditions remaining nearly unchanged. For authorities, the question was no longer whether people wanted to go there. It was whether they should be allowed to. And in certain cases, the answer was no. Not as a punishment, not as secrecy, but as a matter of responsibility. Mammoth Cave is not managed as an attraction alone. It is managed as a protected system, one that must balance public access with long-term preservation. Closing parts of the cave was not an admission of failure. It was an acknowledgement of limits of control, limits of prediction, limits of what human presence can safely coexist with. Importantly, these decisions were not made to stop exploration entirely. Research continued, but under stricter conditions, fewer people, shorter exposure, more oversight. Access was no longer assumed. It had to be justified. And once that standard changed, some areas could no longer meet it. Those sections were not closed because they were mysterious. They were closed because they were vulnerable, because protecting the system required reducing contact. And because in environments like this, prevention matters more than response. By the time these measures were fully in place, Mammoth Cave had entered a different phase of its history, not as a place defined by how far humans could go, but by how carefully they chose where to stop. Even as access began to change, Mammoth Cave did not become empty. People were still going inside, not all for the same reasons, not under the same conditions, and not with the same level of oversight. The most visible group was the public. Guided tours continued along approved routes. Visitors followed marked paths, led by trained rangers, within areas considered manageable under existing safety and preservation standards. These entries were structured, timed, monitored, but public access was only one layer. Beyond the tour roads, survey teams were still active. Cartographers, geologists, researchers mapping airflow, monitoring temperature, studying biology, in sections not open to visitors. Their work required deeper access, longer exposure, repeated entry into sensitive zones. Each visit was planned, authorized, documented, and yet, even regulated access added pressure. Equipment had to be carried, markers placed and removed. Human presence extended into areas designed for stability, not traffic. Then there were the scientists focused on life underground, biologists tracking bat populations, ecologists studying species that exist nowhere else on Earth, specialists monitoring changes that could not be detected from the surface. Their presence was necessary, but necessity did not eliminate impact. Every entry, even for research, introduced movement, heat, and disturbance into a system that responded slowly, but permanently. Beyond these groups, there was another category that proved harder to manage. Individuals driven, not by study or tourism, but by exploration itself. Experienced cavers, adventure seekers, people drawn to places that are difficult to read, precisely because they are difficult. Some entered with permission, under limited programs, others did not. Despite closures, Despite restricted access, some individuals attempted to enter sealed sections, through forgotten passages, through unofficial routes, through gaps that were never meant to become entrances again. Not all of them intended harm. Many believed they were continuing a tradition of exploration. But unregulated entry introduced risks that authorities could not track or mitigate. No safety oversight, no biological controls, no accountability if something went wrong. In a system as interconnected as Mammoth Cave, one unauthorized entry could affect more than one person. It could affect airflow patterns, sensitive habitats, disease transmission, emergency response capacity. And once that line was crossed, the question changed again. It was no longer about who should be allowed inside. It became about who could not be prevented from trying. At that point, management shifted from access to containment, from guiding people through to keeping people out. Not because curiosity was wrong, not because exploration had ended, but because the caves could no longer absorb uncontrolled presence from any direction. Mammoth Caves had become a place where intention mattered less than cumulative impact. And the more groups continued to enter, legitimately or not, the clearer one reality became: control, not curiosity, would determine what could remain open. At a certain point, the question was no longer who should be allowed inside. It became whether the system itself could still be controlled. Mammoth Cave is not a space that can be opened or closed at will. It is an interconnected network where airflow, humidity, temperature, and life are linked across vast distances. Underground, in a system like this, control does not mean removing humans entirely. It means reducing frequency, limiting exposure time, and minimizing points of entry to level that can be managed. Authorities were not facing a single decision. They were facing an operational problem. Every open passage became a point of risk. Every entry introduced a new variable, and each variable accumulated. As the number of groups accessing the system increased, tourists, survey teams, scientists, maintenance crews, and even unauthorized entrants, predictability began to break down. Not because of a lack of data, but because too many factors were acting at the same time. In that context, soft measures were no longer sufficient. Warning signs could not stop those determined to go deeper. Safety guidelines could not protect areas with fragile structures. Manual supervision could not keep pace with a system stretching hundreds of kilometers. Control, therefore, was no longer optional. It became a requirement. This led to structural changes. Gates were installed at key access points. Secondary routes were removed from regular use. Permit procedures were tightened, not to restrict knowledge, but to limit impact. Every entry had to be justified. Every activity had to be evaluated in a broader context, not just local effects, but system-wide consequences. At this stage, the goal was no longer to maximize access. The goal was to maintain stability. Stability of the microclimate, stability of biological systems, stability of structure, and most importantly, stability of management. Because once control is lost, every response comes too late. Rescue becomes harder. Restoration becomes nearly impossible. In environments like this, mistakes are not corrected by another attempt. They leave lasting traces. So authorities chose to establish clear boundaries, not to end human curiosity, but to ensure that curiosity did not exceed what the system could tolerate. When control became the priority and Mammoth Cave was no longer managed for expansion, it was managed for limitation. And that shift has defined how humans approach this cave system to this day. Even after decades of exploration, Mammoth Cave is not fully known. Hundreds of kilometers have been surveyed and mapped, but experts agree that what has been documented represents only a portion of the system. Large sections remain home. beyond practical access, not because they are hidden by secrecy, but because reaching them would require conditions that cannot be justified. Some passages are too narrow to allow safe movement. Others extend into zones with unstable airflow or limited oxygen. There are chambers where temperature and humidity must remain unchanged to preserve fragile formations and sensitive ecosystems. In these areas, even brief human presence could alter conditions that have remained stable for thousands of years. There are also sections that are known but deliberately left unentered, not unexplored, but unvisited, mapped from a distance, observed indirectly, left intact, because further access would offer little new knowledge while increasing risk. Scientific tools have expanded what can be measured remotely. Sensors track airflow. Data loggers record temperature and humidity over time. But there are limits to what instruments can replace. Some questions require physical presence. And in Mammoth Cave, that presence comes at a cost. As a result, certain boundaries remain in place, not as temporary measures, but as long-term decisions. Boundaries that reflect current understanding and current restraint. Importantly, these inaccessible areas are not seen as failures of exploration. They are seen as evidence of maturity, a recognition that knowledge gain does not always justify access granted. Mammoth Cave continues to change, slowly, on geological timescales. But human interaction with it has changed more rapidly. From extraction to exploration, to access, to control, and now to limits. What remains inaccessible is not simply what lies beyond the map. It is what lies beyond our ability to intervene safely. In that sense, the unanswered spaces are not empty. They are protected. And the final question is not whether humans will someday go deeper. It is whether, when that moment comes, they will recognize where the line should be drawn. Where do you think the line should be? And who gets to decide it?